This week at Starbase, SpaceX pushes on with a tank farm expansion, construction is full steam ahead on Pad B, and scrapping of Ship 32 is nearly complete. Now let's dig into this week's update. Concrete crews began setting up early on Friday morning, placing more concrete behind the latest tank farm expansion work. A race of high-pressure gas tanks was delivered to the launch site a bit before sunrise. The cylinder rack was then unloaded and put in place. Another rack of high-pressure tanks arrived just a few minutes later and was placed on top of the first. SpaceX's LR-11000 crane was repositioned ahead of a vertical tank lift at the tank farm. Then the tandem lift began for the new propellant tank, with the cranes raising it vertical for installation before it was put in place. Meanwhile, a load of structural steel passed by the D2 gate, heading towards D1. The tank's transport jig and transport then headed back up Highway 4, returning to storage. One of the welding robots was removed from High Bay and brought over to the Star Factory. This may be the start of the bay's decommissioning ahead of its expected replacement with the upcoming Giga Bay. Additional supporting hardware for the High Bay weld tool was also removed and put in storage. Forms were then raised for a reinforced concrete blast protection wall around the latest extension of the tank farm. 2 cryogenic pipe segments and a large steel stand were delivered to the launch site. The pipes were unloaded a few minutes later. In order to keep the pump motor hardware cooled, a sleeve is needed to control the flow of coolant. One of these was installed at the tank farm expansion. Bundles of rebar were lowered into the flame trench as work begins on the reinforced foundation mat at the bottom of the trench. The forward 3-ring segment for Booster 17's methane tank left Star Factory early on Saturday and headed over towards Mega Bay 1. And after sunrise, a concrete pump truck then set up for another pour at the launch site. 3 hours later, the concrete team's work was done. Workers continued on the forms for the new blast wall around the most recent expansion of the propellant farm. Meanwhile, 2 cryogenic pipe sections were delivered. These appear to be the connections between the subcoolers and the rest of the plumbing. Straight links of insulated cryopipe arrived a few minutes later. A pump stand was then lifted into place at the cryo plant, while blast wall forms continued to rise around the site. A heavy load of rebar was delivered to the launch site. I think these are going to be used for the new bunker next to the tank farm. The cryo pump for the new stand arrived at the launch site just after noon. These high-power pumps push the liquid oxygen and liquid methane into the Starship and Super Heavy. One of the cranes was driven out of the launch site up Highway 4, returning to the build site. When it arrived, the crane was taken inside the cordon in front of High Bay. The crane then moved up to the High Bay door before being repositioned and driven inside. Panels that look like cladding elements with integrated cooling channels were delivered to the launch site. A large section of cryopipe with elbows and a junction was lifted in place behind the valve sleds. Workers then removed the anchor straps from the second tower's chopsticks, leaving only one strap to be removed before they were free to move under their own power. The final strap at the center of the chopsticks spans over the flame trench, so workers in a man basket were used to untether the 2 chopstick arms. An extra-large valve sled and additional cryoplant equipment passed by the D2 gate before being brought in and unloaded at the launch site. A second valve sled, identical to the first, arrived shortly afterward. The chopsticks at Pad B performed their first movement, with the left arm swinging out. The sticks were further extended to make sure everything was working right. Over at the build site, the Tadano crane was used to lift one of the cutout sections of Ship 32 back into High Bay. With the first extension checks made, the arm was swung in. The right stick made its first movement a few hours later, swinging out and back in. With these first tests complete now, the arms were reset to their closed positions. A new subcooler was delivered to the launch site on Tuesday morning. These are used to cool down the propellants to just above their freezing point during fueling. A second subcooler, wrapped in tarps, was delivered to the launch site and staged outside the D1 gate. Following a 30-minute wait, the second subcooler was brought inside the launch complex. The new cryopump that was delivered that previous day was raised upright and positioned for installation. A third subcooler was then delivered to the launch complex. This unit stopped near the D2 gate before heading down to D3. After spending some time outside, the pump was lifted up and set down inside the pump housing at the cryo plant. Welders did some work on a steel post just inside the fence. This piece has several concrete embeds attached to its surface. Inside Megabay 2, a catch point doubling plate was lifted up the right-hand side of Starship 35 for installation. The first of the new subcoolers was brought outside of the staging area at D3 and backed into the launch site at D2. A fourth subcooler arrived at the launch site and was sent to the staging area. The first subcooler was lifted into place behind the valve and pump sleds. The tarp-covered subcooler was then backed into the launch site. Prefabricated structural steel, thought to be part of the booster quick disconnect and propellant loading gantry, was delivered to the launch site. The new launch pad appears to be using separate structures for the launch table and the other supporting infrastructures at the pad. The second of the four subcoolers was then lifted into place next to the first. Over at the build site, the Starlink dispenser installation jig was moved from the right-hand side of Megabay 2 to the doorway area. A white ring stand was brought out and set down in front of the door, followed by the Starlink dispenser installation jig. This smaller diameter pipe section was brought to the launch site for installation. The third subcooler was backed into the launch site a few minutes later. Back at the build site, the installation jig and ring stand were brought into Star Factory. A length of insulated cryogenic pipe was installed at the site cryo plant. The third subcooler was unloaded and set down on the ground, while the fourth was backed into the launch site. Starship 36's methane tank forward dome section rolled out of Star Factory with heat shield tiles and was brought into Megabay 2. After stripping the tiles off each section of Ship 32, the bare metal was sent to the scrapyard. The left side catch pin doubler plate was lifted into place for installation on Ship 35. Another section of Ship 32 was taken into high bay for tile removal. Two more subcoolers were delivered to the launch site on a rainy Wednesday morning. The launch complex's liquid oxygen and liquid methane supplies both have their own banks of subcoolers to chill down the propellants. The first subcooler of the day, and the fifth overall, was backed into the launch site. The subcooler was unloaded and immediately set down, while another subcooler was sent to the staging area near D3. The second subcooler of the day, along with a few other pieces of equipment, pulled into the launch site. The subcooler was then unloaded and set down on the ground. A crane from Link Belt's charity Pink Belt program was delivered to the launch site. The Pink Belt program raises funds for breast cancer awareness, treatment, and research. Booster 15's hot stage adapter was moved out of Star Factory and taken to Megabay 1 for installation. If all goes well, Flight 8 may happen as soon as the 26th. Another vertical storage tank was delivered to the launch site on Thursday. A transport carried the tank horizontally down Highway 4 before pulling into the launch site. The empty hot stage adapter stand was brought back to Star Factory, indicating that the adapter is now mounted to Booster 15. Workers from a second concrete team began setting up to fill the forms for the new blast protection wall. With the plates removed now, an excavator began backfilling the trench near the D2 gate at the launch site. A Starship forward flap was delivered to the build site through the B2 gate and staged near Star Factory. About a half an hour later, the forward flap was unloaded and brought into the factory. Additional tank farm plumbing and welding gas were delivered to the site. Making use of two cranes, the new tank was uprighted and set in place. A flatbed truck full of rebar was delivered to the launch site. With 3 concrete structures under construction right now, rebar is high in demand. The second pump truck finished up its work at the blast wall and began stowing its boom. An insulated subcooler was then lifted and moved into place in front of the valve sleds. The subcooler that had been sitting next to the D2 gate entrance was picked up and installed next to the insulated unit. Meanwhile, another pipe rack stand was put in place. The detiled common dome section from Ship 32 was taken out of high bay. The payload section was then brought into the bay for tile removal. The chopsticks on the Padre tower began a round of testing in the evening. The catch arms were raised up and set in the launch position before performing a simulated booster catch. The chopsticks were then opened back to the catch position. This week at the Cape, pile driving continued at LC-39A Starship launch pad, which is being reconfigured for a flame trench. 2 liquid nitrogen tanks were brought out from 39A and taken to the turn basin on Saturday. They'll be transported to Starbase by barge. A Falcon 9 fairing with its encapsulated Starlink Group 10-12 payload was rolled out to the horizontal integration facility. Cygnet Warhorse 2 towed just read the instructions out to sea to support the Group 10-12 launch. Bob then headed out on Sunday, also in support of the Starlink launch. Multiple storage tanks were positioned to roll onto a barge at the turn basin before their journey down to Starbase. A 6th one joined the other 5 shortly after noon. On Monday, SpaceX support ship Doug returned to Port Canaveral with both fairing halves from the Starlink Group 12-8 launch. Cygnet Warhorse 1 towed home a short fall of gravitas, as well as flight leader Booster 1067 after its 26th successful mission, which carried Starlink Group 12-8 into orbit. Falcon 9 Booster 1077 was lowered onto a horizontal transport for its journey to Roberts Road, freeing up the dockside stand for Booster 1067. Over the course of the day, 5 of the 6 horizontal storage tanks were loaded onto a barge at the turn basin. The basin was originally built to unload the Saturn rocket stages, built and barged in from the Michoud Assembly Facility in Louisiana. The 6th tank was loaded onto the barge on Tuesday morning, leaving just 1 tank left to go. Booster 1067 was then offloaded from a short fall of gravitas and set down on the dockside stand. The 7th and final tank was loaded onto the barge. Once it was tied down, the barge was ready to head out to Starbase. Cygnet Warhorse 1 towed a short fall of gravitas back out to sea to support the Starlink Group 12-14 launch, which successfully lifted off on Friday. Falcon 9 Booster 1080 successfully lifted off for the Starlink Group 10-12 mission, carrying 23 more Starlink satellites into orbit. Doug then departed Port Canaveral on Wednesday to support the Starlink Group 12-14 launch. And finally, Bob returned on Thursday, ferrying both fairing halves 165 and 198 back to port from the Starlink Group 10-12 launch. And there you have it, another SpaceX and Starbase weekly update brought to you by LabPadre. Don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button if you haven't already, guys, and maybe we'll see you in a few days for Flight 8. Until next time, LabPadre out.